Time during the Second World War did not move the way it usually does. It stretched, compressed, froze, and then suddenly rushed forward, depending on where a person stood and what they were waiting for. For someone reading about the war decades later, years are counted cleanly, from 1939 to 1945. But for the people living inside those years, time was rarely measured in dates. It was measured in sirens, in footsteps on stairwells, in letters that arrived late or not at all, in the long silence between one explosion and the next. For many civilians, time slowed to an unfamiliar pace. Ordinary clocks still ticked, but daily life was stripped of its usual markers. Shops opened irregularly, trains ran when they could, and meals were no longer fixed points in the day, but rare events shaped by ration cards and availability. Waiting became the dominant activity. Waiting for news, waiting for electricity to return, waiting for the sound of aircraft to fade into the distance. Days felt endless, yet weeks disappeared without warning, blurring together into something shapeless and heavy. In cities under bombardment, time was broken into fragments. There was the moment before the sirens began, when the air felt tense and strangely quiet. Then the rush to shelters, basements, or underground stations. Minutes stretched unbearably long as people counted explosions, trying to guess how close they were, wondering whether the next one would land nearby or directly above them. In those shelters, time often dissolved completely. People lost track of hours, sometimes even days, emerging into daylight, unsure whether it was morning or evening, unsure how much of their world still existed. For soldiers, time could feel brutally repetitive. Days followed rigid schedules when possible, waking, marching, cleaning weapons, waiting for orders that might never come. Long periods of boredom were punctuated by moments of intense violence that felt both instantaneous and eternal. A firefight lasting a few minutes could imprint itself more deeply than months of routine. Many veterans later struggled to explain how time seemed to collapse during combat, how seconds expanded, allowing them to notice details they would otherwise never have seen. The texture of mud, the sound of breath inside a helmet, the way light reflected off metal just before everything changed. Night carried its own rhythm. Darkness during the war was different from peacetime darkness. Blackouts transformed cities into silent, unfamiliar spaces. Streetlights were turned off, windows covered, headlights dimmed or removed entirely. Time at night felt suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. People learned to move slowly, carefully, memorizing routes they once navigated without thought. A short walk could take much longer, not because of distance, but because of caution. Letters were one of the few ways time could travel. A letter written weeks earlier might arrive suddenly, carrying emotions from the past into the present. Soldiers wrote about events that had already ended by the time their words were read. Families replied to situations that no longer existed. This constant delay created a strange emotional time lag, where people reacted to moments already gone, while living in circumstances their loved ones could not yet imagine. Some letters crossed oceans, only to arrive after the person who wrote them had already died, freezing their final thoughts in a moment that would never move forward. Children experienced wartime differently still. For many, the war became the background against which their entire sense of normalcy was formed. A child born in 1940 might not remember a world without uniforms, rationing, or fear. School days were interrupted or canceled entirely. Summers felt oddly quiet, with fewer adults around, fewer celebrations, fewer certainties. Time for children could feel both endless and abruptly interrupted, with play suddenly replaced by evacuation trains or unfamiliar countryside homes. Evacuation itself altered time. For children sent away from cities to rural areas, days became slow and disorienting. They waited to hear from parents they could not see, counting time not in dates but in visits that might or might not happen. For parents left behind, time accelerated painfully as weeks passed without knowing whether their children were safe, growing, forgetting them, or changing beyond recognition. Food shaped time as well. Meals were no longer daily comforts, but events planned carefully around rations. People learned to stretch ingredients, to invent new recipes, to make time-consuming preparations out of necessity. Cooking took longer, not because of complexity, but because of scarcity. The absence of something as simple as sugar or butter could slow an entire day. Hunger itself altered the perception of time, making hours feel longer, more physical, more demanding. On the front lines, seasons mattered deeply. Winter felt endless, with cold slowing everything down: movement, equipment, even thought. Fingers stiffened, machines failed, sleep became fragmented. Summer brought its own distortions, with heat, insects, and exhaustion stretching days thin. Soldiers often remembered the war not by years, but by winters survived, by summers endured, by specific days when the weather itself seemed to decide who lived and who did not. For prisoners of war and those in camps, time was reduced to survival. Days lost their names. Calendars were forbidden or meaningless. Some prisoners scratched marks into walls or kept secret counts in their minds, while others abandoned counting entirely to avoid despair. Time became something to endure rather than measure. The future shrank to the next meal, the next roll call, the next sunrise. Memory and hope were often the only ways to escape the present moment, even briefly. Meanwhile, far from the fighting, time continued in an uneven way. Factories ran day and night, shifts blending together. Workers measured time by sirens that signaled the start and end of labor, by quotas rather than clocks. Sleep came in fragments. Fatigue accumulated quietly, making weeks feel heavier than they should have been. Even victory, when it eventually arrived, did not feel immediate. It took time for people to believe the war was truly over, for their bodies and minds to release the tension they had been carrying for years. As the war dragged on, people began to speak of time in terms of endurance. Phrases like "getting through this year" or "holding on until spring" became common. The future was imagined not in distant dreams, but in small, reachable points: the next month, the next season, the next rumor of peace. Time became something to survive, something to outlast, rather than something to enjoy. And yet, within this altered flow of time, quiet moments still existed. A shared cigarette, a whispered joke in a shelter, the sound of a radio playing softly in the dark. These moments felt suspended, almost outside the war itself, as if time briefly remembered how it used to move. People clung to them, knowing they were temporary, knowing that soon the clock would resume its harsh, uneven rhythm. The Second World War did not just change borders and governments, it changed how millions of people experienced time itself. Minutes became precious or terrifying. Days became obstacles. Years became something no one could quite grasp until they were already gone. As the war settled into everyday life, time began to behave like a cautious animal. It no longer moved in straight lines. Instead, it circled, hesitated, and sometimes retreated. People stopped asking what day it was and began asking what had happened most recently. Yesterday mattered less than the last air raid. Tomorrow was an abstract idea, too distant to be trusted. The present moment became dominant, heavy with uncertainty. In many homes, clocks were still mounted on walls, but they were rarely consulted for comfort. Knowing the exact hour offered little reassurance when the future was unstable. Some people stopped winding their clocks altogether. Others let them run fast or slow without correcting them, as if precise timekeeping no longer belonged to this world. Time became personal, subjective, shaped by fear, routine, and survival, rather than by calendars. Radio broadcasts played a powerful role in shaping how time was experienced. News arrived at fixed hours, and entire nations paused to listen. These moments divided the day more clearly than meals or sleep. People remembered days by what the radio announced: a city lost, a front advancing, a leader speaking. When broadcasts were interrupted or delayed, time felt incomplete, as though the day itself had failed to arrive properly. Silence also became a measure of time. In occupied territories, silence carried weight. The absence of footsteps in a hallway, the lack of voices in a street, the sudden quiet after years of normal sound, all of these marked the passage of hours more clearly than clocks ever could. Silence could mean safety, or it could mean danger. People learned to listen not just for noise, but for its absence. In hospitals, time slowed in a different way. Wounded soldiers lay in beds where days blended together under white ceilings and dim lights. Pain distorted time, making nights endless and days fragmented. Nurses measured time in medication intervals, in bandage changes, in small improvements or sudden declines. For those who recovered, time felt borrowed. For those who did not, it narrowed until only the present breath mattered. Grief altered time perhaps more deeply than anything else. When someone received news of a death, time seemed to break. The world continued moving, but the person experiencing loss felt stuck in a single moment that repeated endlessly. Some people described feeling as though time had stopped the instant they read a telegram or heard a knock at the door. Others felt time rush cruelly forward, carrying them away from the last moment they had shared with the person they lost. Marriage, birth, and other life events still occurred, but they existed in a strange relationship with time. Weddings were often rushed, stripped of ceremony, as if the couple feared time might not allow for delay. Children were born into a world already in motion, their earliest memories shaped by uniforms and uncertainty. Parents measured their children's growth against the length of the war itself, noting how tall they had become since the last major event, how their voices had changed since a father had left. For people in resistance movements, time became something to manipulate. Timing was everything. Minutes mattered more than days. Operations depended on precise coordination, yet those involved lived in a constant state of waiting. They waited for signals, for opportunities, for moments when time briefly aligned with possibility. A single delayed action could mean failure or death. Time was both a tool and an enemy. In contrast, for those hiding, whether in attics, basements, forests, or false walls, time became almost unreal. Days were spent in near stillness, moving as little as possible, listening carefully. The outside world continued, but those in hiding experienced time as suspension. Some later described these periods as existing outside normal life, as if time itself had stepped around them and continued elsewhere. Weather became another way of understanding time. Rain could mean delay, snow could mean isolation, fog could mean safety or danger depending on circumstance. People learned to read the sky not for beauty, but for what it allowed or prevented. A clear day might bring aircraft. A storm might bring relief. Time was no longer abstract. It was physical, tied to the environment. In factories producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies, time was consumed by production. Shifts overlapped. Night and day lost meaning under artificial light. Workers marked time by output rather than hours. Exhaustion accumulated quietly, and many people only realized how tired they were when the war ended and their bodies finally relaxed. During the war, fatigue was simply another constant, another part of time's weight. The concept of after the war became a shared future tense. People spoke of it as if it were a place rather than a time. After the war, we will became a way to hold on to hope. This imagined future existed vividly in people's minds, even as the present dragged on. Paradoxically, this future-focused thinking made the present feel both shorter and longer. Shorter because it was meant to end, longer because the end remained out of reach. Time also behaved differently depending on distance from the front. Those far from combat sometimes felt guilty about how normally time seemed to pass for them. Their days still had routines, meals, work, even entertainment. Yet this normal time was fragile, always under threat. A single announcement could pull them suddenly into the war's altered rhythm. Rumors traveled faster than facts, distorting time further. A rumor about victory or defeat could spread in hours, shaping emotions before reality caught up. When the truth finally arrived, it often felt late, almost irrelevant, because people had already lived through the emotional consequences. Time became layered: the time of rumor, the time of belief, and the time of confirmation. As the war neared its end, time took on a strange tension. People sensed change, but did not trust it. Each new development felt provisional. Even liberation, when it came, unfolded unevenly. For some, the war ended suddenly, marked by celebration and relief. For others, it ended slowly, with confusion, displacement, and lingering danger. The end of war did not mean the immediate return of normal time. Afterward, people struggled to reconnect with peacetime rhythms. Sleeping through the night felt unfamiliar. Silence felt too quiet. Some found themselves waking at the same hour they had during the war, their bodies still tuned to old schedules. Time had left an imprint, one that did not fade easily. Memory became the final keeper of wartime time. Survivors remembered not just events, but how long things felt, how endless certain days seemed, how brief others were. These memories were not chronological, they were emotional, shaped by fear, hope, and endurance. When people spoke about the war later, they often skipped years, lingering instead on moments that had stretched themselves thin across their minds. In this way, the Second World War created multiple versions of time, all existing at once. There was official time, recorded in documents and histories. There was lived time, experienced unevenly by millions. And there was remembered time, reshaped endlessly by reflection and distance. For those who lived through it, the war never truly occupied 6 neat years. It occupied a lifetime of perception. It changed how time felt, how it was valued, how it was feared. Even decades later, many spoke of those years as if they existed separately from the rest of their lives, governed by different rules, moving according to a logic that only made sense when survival was the primary goal. Another way time passed during the Second World War was through absence. Absence was not empty, it was full of weight. Empty chairs at tables, unused beds, coats left hanging for years. Time was counted by how long something had been missing. A man might say he had not seen his brother since before the war, as if that phrase itself were a date. People measured years not by calendars, but by what had disappeared and not returned. In many households, evenings stretched longer than they ever had before. Without reliable electricity, entertainment became minimal. Candles burned slowly, oil lamps hissed softly, and people sat quietly, listening to distant sounds. Conversations drifted and faded. Silence was no longer awkward, it was practical. In those long evenings, time thickened. A single hour could feel like several, especially when sleep was difficult and anxiety lingered just below the surface. Sleep itself changed the shape of time. Dreams became vivid, repetitive, and often disturbing. People woke suddenly, unsure whether the sounds they heard were real or imagined. Nightmares blurred into waking life. Rest was shallow, fractured. The body never fully surrendered to sleep, and as a result, days felt longer, heavier, as though each one carried the exhaustion of many. For people living under occupation, time was layered with performance. Daily routines continued, but they were hollow imitations of former life. People went to work, greeted neighbors, stood in lines, all while carefully measuring every word and gesture. Time passed under constant observation. A wrong look, a pause that lasted too long, a step taken at the wrong moment could alter everything. This vigilance made time feel sharp, edged, never smooth. Markets and public spaces developed their own slow rhythm. Queues formed early and dissolved late. Waiting became communal. People stood together for hours, sometimes speaking quietly, sometimes not at all. In these lines, time was shared. A delay affected everyone equally. There was a strange fairness in this enforced slowness, though it offered little comfort. Time also passed through sound. Footsteps echoing in stairwells, boots on cobblestone, engines overhead. The sound of a single aircraft could stretch a minute into eternity. People learned to identify time by sound alone, the difference between a passing patrol and an approaching one, between distant thunder and incoming danger. Sound became a clock more accurate than any watch. For sailors and airmen, time became inseparable from navigation. Long hours passed watching instruments, horizons, clouds. Over open sea or sky, time felt exposed. There were no landmarks to break it into pieces. Hours merged. A mission could feel endless, yet afterwards seem impossibly brief. Many described returning from sorties unable to explain where the time had gone, only that it had been filled entirely by attention. Training camps created another distortion. Days were rigidly structured, but weeks vanished quickly. Repetition compressed time. Drill after drill blurred together. Men remembered being trained intensely, but struggled to recall specific days. Time became muscle memory rather than narrative. For medics, time was triage. Seconds decided outcomes. Yet between emergencies, hours crawled. This constant shifting between urgency and waiting created a jagged experience of time, exhausting and disorienting. A single night shift could feel longer than an entire peaceful week had before the war. Religious time changed too. Prayers took on new urgency. Services were shorter, quieter, sometimes held in secret. Holy days passed with reduced ceremony. People marked time spiritually rather than socially, clinging to rituals that offered continuity. Faith provided an alternative timeline, one that promised meaning beyond immediate suffering. Seasonal celebrations became subdued. Birthdays passed quietly. Anniversaries were remembered internally rather than publicly. Time lost its markers. Without celebration, months slid by unnoticed. People later struggled to remember how old they had been at certain moments, because the usual signals of aging had been muted. Children learned to play with an altered time. Games were interrupted. Toys were scarce. Play happened quickly, intensely, as if children sensed it could be taken away at any moment. Childhood itself felt compressed. Many grew older faster, not in years, but in awareness. Time accelerated emotionally, even as days dragged physically. For refugees, time was movement and waiting combined. Long journeys followed by long pauses. Borders crossed only to stop again. Time became something carried rather than lived. Past life felt distant, future life undefined. The present was temporary by definition. This instability made time fragile, easy to lose track of. In bombed cities, rebuilding introduced yet another rhythm. Clearing rubble took time measured in effort, not hours. Each stone removed was progress, but progress was slow. People watched walls rise inch by inch, week by week. Time regained a physical dimension, visible in reconstructed streets and patched buildings. Language itself changed how time was spoken about. People adopted vague expressions. These days, for now, lately. Precision disappeared. This vagueness reflected a collective uncertainty. No one wanted to promise a future that might not arrive. Time in newspapers felt unreal. Headlines described events happening far away or long ago by the time they were printed. Reading the news felt like reading history that was still unfinished. Yesterday's paper already felt outdated, yet tomorrow's paper was never guaranteed. For those forced into labor, time was owned by others. Days were assigned. Rest was rationed. Personal time barely existed. The body learned endurance beyond expectation. Some later said they survived by mentally escaping time, retreating into memory or imagination while the body continued working. As the war continued, people stopped counting how long it had lasted. Instead, they counted how long it had been since something good had happened, since a letter arrived, since a laugh felt real, since fear had briefly loosened its grip. These measurements mattered more than years. When rumors of peace began circulating, time became nervous. People did not trust hope easily. Each false ending made waiting harder. Anticipation stretched days painfully thin. Some preferred not to think about the end at all, fearing disappointment more than continuation. When peace finally came in many places, time did not immediately normalize. Celebration was followed by confusion. What now? What pace should life take? Many felt strangely unprepared for the return of choice. During the war, time had been imposed. After it, time required decisions again. Long after, survivors often spoke about how the war had permanently altered their sense of time. Some became impatient, unwilling to waste hours. Others moved slowly, savoring ordinary days. The war taught them that time was not guaranteed, not stable, not fair. The Second World War did not just occupy years on a calendar, it reshaped the human relationship with time itself. It taught people to wait, to endure, to survive long stretches of uncertainty. It revealed how fragile normal time truly is, and how quickly it can transform into something heavier, stranger, and more demanding. In quiet retellings, especially at night, this altered time returns. Words slow, sentences stretch, memory settles. Listening becomes a form of shared waiting, a gentle echo of how time once moved when the world held its breath. Time during the Second World War was often experienced through repetition rather than progression. Days did not feel like steps forward, but like circles drawn again and again on the same worn ground. People woke, dressed, worked, waited, slept, and woke again, not because life demanded it, but because stopping would have been more frightening than continuing. This repetition created a peculiar sense that time was not moving forward, but wearing itself thinner. Morning did not bring freshness. It brought continuation. The same worries resumed where they had been left the night before. For many, mornings were not about beginning, but about resuming endurance. Light through a window did not promise opportunity. It simply confirmed survival for another day. Time, in this sense, became proof of persistence rather than change. Public clocks still marked hours, but few trusted them emotionally. Mechanical time functioned, but psychological time obeyed different rules. An hour spent worrying felt longer than an entire afternoon spent working. A brief moment of relief could outweigh days of tension. The scale by which time was felt no longer matched the scale by which it was measured. In offices and administrative buildings, paperwork multiplied. Forms, permits, stamps, approvals. Time was consumed not by action, but by process. People spent hours waiting for documents that represented movement without moving anyone. This bureaucratic time was slow and impersonal, yet powerful. It decided who could travel, who could stay, who could eat, who could work. Time here was authority. Transportation altered time profoundly. Trains were delayed, rerouted, canceled. Journeys that once took hours stretched into days. Waiting rooms became temporary homes. Platforms filled with people sitting on luggage, unsure when or whether they would leave. Travel time lost predictability. Distance was no longer measured in kilometers, but in uncertainty. Time also passed through compromise. People adjusted expectations downward. They planned less. Dreams became smaller, closer, more cautious. This shrinking of ambition slowed emotional time. The future no longer pulled people forward. It hovered, vague and restrained. Radio broadcasts played a powerful role in shaping how time was experienced. News arrived at fixed hours, and entire nations paused to listen. These moments divided the day more clearly than meals or sleep. People remembered days by what the radio announced: a city lost, a front advancing, a leader speaking. When broadcasts were interrupted or delayed, time felt incomplete, as though the day itself had failed to arrive properly. Silence also became a measure of time. In occupied territories, silence carried weight. The absence of footsteps in a hallway, the lack of voices in a street, the sudden quiet after years of normal sound, all of these marked the passage of hours more clearly than clocks ever could. Silence could mean safety, or it could mean danger. People learned to listen not just for noise, but for its absence.
Economic time changed too. Money lost its former meaning. Inflation, shortages, black markets distorted value. People paid more attention to what could be exchanged rather than what something was worth. Time was spent searching, bargaining, improvising. In rural areas, agricultural time persisted stubbornly. Crops still needed planting, harvests still came, seasons still turned. This continuity offered a cloudy contrast to chaos elsewhere. Farmers measured time by soil and sky, maintaining an older rhythm that resisted disruption. Yet even nature felt altered. Forests hid danger, fields became battlefields, rivers marked boundaries. Natural time intersected with human conflict, reshaping landscapes and memories. Time for leaders and decision-makers moved rapidly and abstractly. Meetings, maps, reports, decisions made in minutes affected millions over years. This compression of consequence distorted moral time. Outcomes unfolded slowly, far from the moment they were chosen. For ordinary people, decisions were often delayed, postponed until absolutely necessary. Acting too soon could be as dangerous as acting too late. Hesitation became a survival skill. Time spent deciding was time spent alive.
Time also passed through adaptation. People learned new skills quickly. They repaired what they once replaced. They reused what they once discarded. This improvisation gave time a practical texture, filled with small problem-solving moments. In homes, objects aged differently. Furniture wore faster. Clothing was patched repeatedly. Material time accelerated, even as personal progress slowed. Things bore the marks of prolonged use, becoming records of endurance. Language absorbed wartime time. Expressions changed. Words like soon and later lost clarity. Promises became conditional. Speech softened, avoided certainty. This linguistic uncertainty reflected a broader temporal instability. As the war continued, fatigue accumulated silently, not the kind that sleep cures, but the kind that settles into bones. This exhaustion slowed perception. Days felt heavier, movements slower. Time seemed thick, resistant. Moments of beauty still occurred, often unexpectedly. A song overheard, sunlight on damaged stone, a shared smile. These moments felt detached from wartime, existing briefly in a parallel flow. People remembered them vividly, as if they existed outside chronology. As liberation approached in some regions, time grew tense but restrained. People sensed change but did not celebrate prematurely. Hope was cautious. Anticipation was tempered by experience. Time felt like it was holding back, waiting for confirmation. When structures collapsed, governments, regimes, armies, time briefly became chaotic. Old rules vanished before new ones appeared. Days lacked framework. Freedom arrived without instructions. People navigated this openness slowly, unsure how to inhabit it. After fighting ended, time fractured again. Some rushed forward, eager to rebuild. Others remained emotionally suspended. Trauma delayed return. The calendar moved on, but many remained anchored to wartime perception. Reunions altered time sharply. Seeing someone thought lost compressed years into moments. Conversations jumped backward and forward, filling gaps unevenly. Time was reconstructed through shared memory. For many, the war permanently altered how time was valued. Some guarded it fiercely, unwilling to waste it. Others drifted, having learned how little control time truly allows. The Second World War transformed time from a neutral backdrop into an active force. It pressed, stretched, withheld, and reshaped human experience. It taught patience without promise, endurance without certainty. During the Second World War, time often passed unnoticed, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening at once. When events became constant, they lost their ability to stand out. People stopped marking days because each day carried similar tension, similar uncertainty, similar effort. The mind, overwhelmed by continuity, began to flatten experience. Time became a surface rather than a sequence. Many people described the war years as a long, uninterrupted stretch, difficult to divide afterward. When asked to remember specific moments, they often struggled, not because memory failed, but because time during the war resisted separation. Everything seemed connected, like one extended day that began with shock and ended with exhaustion. For those living near borders that shifted repeatedly, time was unstable in a geographic sense. A town could belong to one authority one month and another the next. Calendars changed, official holidays changed, rules changed, yet the streets remained the same. Time felt inconsistent, as though history itself could not decide which direction to move. People learned to live without temporal loyalty, adapting quickly to each new version of the present. In households, domestic time transformed quietly. Chores took longer. Repair replaced replacement. Washing clothes by hand, mending fabric repeatedly, preserving food carefully. These tasks expanded daily schedules. What had once been background activity now consumed hours. Time became tactile, filled with repetitive motion and careful attention. Many people experience time through restraint. They delayed reactions, controlled emotions, measured speech. Emotional expression slowed. Laughter was brief. Anger was contained. Fear was managed internally. This constant regulation stretched inner time, creating a sense of prolonged tension even during externally calm moments. For people whose professions were suspended or rendered meaningless by war, time became hollow. Artists without materials, merchants without goods, academics without institutions, all experienced time as waiting without purpose. Identity lost its temporal structure. Days passed without markers of achievement or progress, leaving a feeling of suspension. The concept of urgency also shifted. Some things that once felt urgent became trivial. Others that had never mattered before gained importance. Finding fuel, securing bread, obtaining news, these small tasks reorganized the hierarchy of time. Hours were allocated based on survival rather than preference. In bomb shelters and cellars, time adopted a subterranean character. Light was artificial, air was stale, movement was limited. People sat close together, sharing space and silence. Minutes stretched unnaturally long. Children fell asleep in unfamiliar positions. Adults stared at walls. Time there felt detached from the surface world, as if it belonged to a different layer of existence. For those who fled cities to countryside or foreign lands, time fractured into before and after departure. The journey itself became a temporal divide. Everything prior felt distant, unreal. Everything afterward felt temporary. Refugees often lived in a perpetual present, hesitant to invest emotionally in days that might soon be replaced by further movement. Time in exile behaved differently. Days lacked roots. People waited not for events, but for permission, for documents, for opportunity. Waiting itself became a form of life. Hope existed, but it was cautious, restrained by experience. Military time followed its own logic. Orders arrived suddenly. Movements were scheduled precisely, yet plans changed constantly. Soldiers lived inside a contradiction. Rigid discipline combined with complete unpredictability. This combination created a sharp, anxious sense of time, where preparation never guaranteed outcome. In the aftermath of battles, time slowed dramatically. Survivors moved carefully, quietly. The world felt fragile. Even sound seemed intrusive. These periods of stillness often lingered longer in memory than the battles themselves. Time here was not dramatic. It was heavy, reflective, subdued. For civilians returning to damaged neighborhoods, time felt layered. The present existed alongside visible traces of the past. Ruins interrupted daily routes. Familiar buildings no longer served their original purpose. Each step forward involved navigating memory as well as space. Time became something one walked through physically.
During shortages, people planned time meticulously: when to cook, when to fetch water, when to queue. Time management became survival strategy. Efficiency replaced comfort. Schedules were built around scarcity rather than abundance. The war also altered how people experienced aging. Children matured faster emotionally. Adults felt prematurely old. The usual milestones of life blurred. People emerged from the war feeling as though they had skipped years or lived multiple lifetimes within a short span. Time in communication was unreliable. Messages were delayed, censored, lost. Conversations occurred out of sync. Responses arrived after circumstances had changed. This delay created emotional confusion. People reacted to words that no longer matched reality. Time between intention and understanding widened. For those engaged in secret activities, time was compartmentalized. Normal life existed alongside hidden schedules, coded meetings, and brief moments of risk. Living double lives fractured temporal awareness. The same hour could contain both ordinary routine and extraordinary danger.
As the war dragged on, people stopped imagining its end clearly. Instead, they focused on maintaining continuity. Survival became less about reaching a future and more about preserving the present. Time became circular, focused on repetition rather than progression. When signs of collapse finally appeared, time felt unstable again. Structures that had seemed permanent dissolved quickly. Authority shifted. Certainty vanished. Days lacked reliable narrative. People adapted by narrowing focus, attending to immediate needs. After surrender and ceasefire, time did not return to normal immediately. Silence felt unfamiliar. The absence of danger required adjustment. Some felt restless, uneasy in peace. Their internal clocks still expected interruption. Reconstruction introduced a slow optimism. Progress was visible but gradual. Time regained direction, but not speed. People learned patience anew, this time with hope rather than fear. Long after the war, many described how those years permanently altered their sense of duration. Peaceful days felt precious but fragile. Normal routines felt almost artificial. Time had been revealed as something that could be reshaped by circumstance, not a constant to be trusted.
The Second World War taught humanity that time is not merely measured, it is lived, resisted, endured, and remembered differently under pressure. It revealed the elasticity of experience, the way hours can expand or vanish depending on meaning. Another way time passed during the Second World War was through substitution. When familiar routines collapsed, people replaced them with improvised ones. These substitutes were rarely satisfying, but they gave shape to the day. A walk replaced a visit. A story replaced a celebration. A habit replaced a plan. Time was no longer filled with intention, but with necessity. People began to organize their days around what could still be done rather than what should have been done. This shift quietly altered how time felt. Instead of being pulled forward by goals, people were pushed along by conditions. The future stopped exerting pressure. The present took over completely. Many noticed that memory behaved differently under these conditions. Recent days were hard to recall, while distant memories became unusually vivid. Childhood scenes resurfaced without warning. The mind seemed to retreat into safer temporal spaces when the present became too demanding. In this way, time folded inward, allowing the past to intrude gently, sometimes comfortingly, sometimes painfully.
Public spaces lost their former tempo. Cafes, when they existed at all, were quiet. Streets emptied earlier. Movement slowed not only because of restrictions, but because there was less reason to hurry. Without appointments, without social gatherings, without entertainment, urgency faded. Time stretched, not dramatically, but persistently. For many people, the war years were marked by a feeling of being slightly behind the world, as though life was happening elsewhere, at another pace. News confirmed this sensation. Events unfolded rapidly on distant fronts, while local life remained static. This mismatch created a strange temporal dissonance. History was accelerating, but daily existence was stalled. In workshops and small businesses, time passed through adaptation. Craftspeople altered techniques to compensate for missing materials. Each adjustment took time, slowed production, and required patience. This craftsmanship-based time was careful and deliberate, resistant to speed. It preserved older rhythms in a world increasingly defined by urgency. For those responsible for others, parents, caregivers, supervisors, time was divided unevenly. Their own hours shrank while responsibility expanded. Worry filled gaps. Rest was postponed indefinitely. Time felt borrowed, already spoken for, never fully one's own.
The war also introduced waiting without expectation. Not hopeful waiting, not anxious waiting, but neutral waiting. People waited because there was nothing else to do. This kind of waiting dulled emotion and softened the edges of time. Hours passed quietly, almost invisibly. Shadows became indicators of time. With limited lighting, people noticed how daylight moved across walls, how evenings arrived earlier, how seasons shifted more noticeably. Time returned to a more elemental form, tied to light and dark rather than schedules. For some, time passed through routine acts of care, feeding animals, tending small gardens, cleaning shared spaces. These acts anchored days, offering a sense of continuity when larger structures failed. Time here was gentle, repetitive, reassuring. In places where destruction was constant, people became adept at rapid adjustment. A damaged route became a new path. A ruined building became a landmark. Time moved forward not by restoring the past, but by redefining the present. Familiarity was rebuilt slowly, piece by piece.
Music altered time profoundly. When radios worked, when instruments survived, music compressed time into emotion. A song could momentarily dissolve years of tension. People remembered specific songs more vividly than dates. Music created pockets of suspended time, brief but powerful. Time was also experienced through physical limitation. Hunger slowed movement, cold stiffened joints, illness lingered longer. The body dictated pace. Time was felt not as abstraction, but as sensation. In communities under constant stress, humor developed quietly. Jokes were subtle, dry, shared carefully. Laughter was brief but meaningful. These moments punctured the heaviness of time, reminding people that not every second belonged to fear. For those who lost homes, time lost its anchor. Without a fixed place, days felt less distinct. Belongings were minimal. Life was reduced to essentials. Time became portable, carried internally rather than structured externally. In correspondence, people learned to write differently. Letters became more reflective, less descriptive. Writers focused on reassurance rather than detail. Time in letters was emotional rather than chronological. Words traveled slower than feelings.
The war also created generational time gaps. Young people and older people experienced the same days differently. Youth adapted quickly, absorbing change as normal. Older generations measured each change against a remembered stability. Time widened between perspectives even within families. As months passed, people developed endurance, not just physically, but temporally. They learned how to live inside uncertainty without constantly reacting to it. This endurance slowed emotional response, smoothing time into something flatter, less jagged. When air raids paused or fronts moved away, time did not immediately relax. The absence of danger took time to register.
People continued living cautiously, as if time itself needed proof before changing behavior. In liberated areas, time became crowded. Activities returned too quickly. Noise, movement, decision-making overwhelmed those accustomed to wartime slowness. Peace felt fast, almost aggressive. Adjusting required patience. Some people felt displaced in time after the war, unable to reconnect with peacetime rhythms. They woke early, expected interruption, felt uneasy in leisure. Their internal clocks had been permanently altered. Others embraced slowness deliberately, protecting quiet routines they had developed during the war. They valued uneventful days, ordinary hours, predictable evenings. Time, once threatening, became something to guard. The Second World War reshaped not only global history, but the private experience of duration. It revealed that time is not neutral. It responds to pressure. It adapts to fear. It bends around survival. During the Second World War, time often revealed itself not through movement, but through restraint. Many people learned to live with less action, fewer choices, and reduced motion. This stillness did not bring peace. Instead, it created a slow, internal vibration, as though time were humming quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. People discovered that when external events became uncontrollable, attention shifted inward. Thoughts grew longer, reflections deepened. A single memory could occupy an entire afternoon. Time passed not because something happened, but because the mind wandered through layers of recollection, imagination, and anticipation. In places untouched by direct combat, time still bore the mark of war. Absence of noise did not mean absence of influence. Even calm regions lived under a suspended awareness, as if normal life were provisional. Time felt conditional, always subject to sudden revision. The pace of decision-making slowed dramatically for ordinary people. Choices were postponed, minimized, or avoided altogether. When every option carried risk, hesitation felt safer than commitment. Time became filled with indecision, which stretched moments thin and made days feel unusually long. Public announcements altered temporal perception. Notices posted on walls, read aloud in squares, or broadcast through loudspeakers interrupted daily flow. These announcements carved time into before and after. Even small changes, new rules, altered hours, reshaped how days were experienced. For people living close to military installations, time was regulated externally. Sirens, schedules, curfews imposed rhythms that replaced natural flow. Life adjusted around imposed hours rather than personal preference. Time felt borrowed, governed, supervised. In workshops, kitchens, and small rooms, people developed intricate micro-routines, folding, sorting, preparing, repairing, for less threatening. The war years produced a heightened awareness of endings. People noticed when something stopped happening, when a shop closed permanently, when a familiar voice disappeared. These endings accumulated quietly, altering time by subtraction rather than addition. For many, the war interrupted life narratives. Plans dissolved, careers stalled, relationships paused. Time lost its storyline. People lived without a clear sense of direction, moving forward without knowing what forward meant. In hospitals and aid stations, time fragmented further. Shifts overlapped, sleep came in short intervals, recovery was uneven. Patients measured time by pain levels, by visits, by gradual changes in strength. Healing redefined time as gradual return rather than linear progress. The experience of waiting rooms during the war deserves attention. These spaces, medical, administrative, transport, became zones of suspended time. People sat together without shared purpose, connected only by delay. Waiting became communal but isolating at the same time. For those separated from loved ones, time stretched emotionally. A single week could feel longer than an entire year before the war. Absence magnified duration. Reunions, when they occurred,
collapse time abruptly, compressing long separation into fragile moments. In occupied territories, time was cautious. People learned not to rush, not to draw attention. Slowness became a survival tactic. Moving deliberately reduced risk. Time here was measured by safety rather than speed. The war also changed how people experienced boredom. Pre-war boredom was mild, temporary. Wartime boredom was dense, heavy, persistent. It did not invite creativity easily. Instead, it settled into the body, making time feel thick and resistant. For those involved in intelligence or covert communication, time was fragmented into secrecy. Messages were short, encoded, incomplete. Understanding arrived slowly. The delay between information and comprehension altered temporal awareness. Knowledge was never immediate. Time in rural isolation differed sharply from time in cities. In remote areas, days retained agricultural rhythms, yet even there, awareness of war altered perception. Familiar routines felt fragile, as though history might intrude at any moment. The war years also introduced a strange phenomenon, temporal humility. People stopped assuming that tomorrow would resemble today. Expectations narrowed. This humility softened disappointment, but intensified uncertainty. In social interactions, conversations slowed. People chose words carefully. Silence was tolerated. This slower communication pace lengthened encounters, even brief ones. A short exchange could feel meaningful simply because it unfolded without urgency.
For some, time passed through faith in systems rather than events. Trust in routines, work, prayer, care provided continuity. Time became something to maintain rather than escape. In destroyed neighborhoods, time left visible scars. Cracks, missing walls, altered routes reminded people constantly of past moments. Walking through these spaces meant walking through layered time, where memory and present overlapped. Children born during the war grew into time without contrast. For them, wartime conditions were not interruptions but baselines. Their sense of duration formed around scarcity, caution, and unpredictability. Later, peace felt unfamiliar. The war also altered how people remembered time afterward. Memories became selective. Long stretches vanished. Certain moments remained vivid. Time reorganized itself in recollection, shaped by emotion rather than sequence. For many survivors, post-war life felt accelerated. Opportunities returned suddenly. Decisions were required. The pace of peace overwhelmed those accustomed to restraint. Time demanded adaptation again. Others resisted acceleration, preserving slow habits learned during the war. They valued predictability, quiet evenings, modest routines. Time, once oppressive, became something to manage gently. The Second World War demonstrated that time is not merely experienced, it is shaped by context, pressure, and perception. Under prolonged uncertainty, time transforms. It stretches inward. It flattens outward. It becomes something endured rather than pursued.